Hey there, it is now time to talk about double pawns. Double pawns are simply two pawns of the same color on one file. And pretty much in line with what we've seen so far, in this case we'll also have a problem with double pawns because we have normally less mobility and the pawns will also have less ability to defend each other. That's why double pawns have some disadvantages, but as we'll see, they might also have some advantages. Let's start by analyzing this position. Here white played the move bishop takes c6. So white is giving a bishop for a knight, but after taking on c6, we can see that black now has two pawns on the c file, the c7 and c6 pawn, and since black doesn't have any pawns on the b or d files, here black has isolated pawns. So in this case we have what we call isolated double pawns. And as we can see, these pawns cannot defend each other, so they can become very vulnerable. Now in return, black has two bishops. Black has this bishop on e6, but in this case I think that it is not enough to compensate for these isolated double pawns, and white played the move d3, which is a typical idea to try to neutralize the opponent's bishop. So white just gave the light square bishop, so now white is placing the pawns on light squares in order to neutralize the activity of the light square bishop that black has. By the way, I just want to mention that taking on e5 was not a good idea because here black would just attack white's king after queen to h4 and queen to f2, so this would be a tactical mistake. And after d3, f6, we see that white cannot castle short, but white played the move b3, and after knight to e7, knight to a4, attacking the bishop, and black continued with the move bishop to b6, and here white continued with this idea of exploiting the opponent's double pawns and played the very strong bishop to a3. Just want to mention that taking on b6 was not white's idea. Here black can take with the c pawn, and after taking, black will not have double pawns anymore and black would be doing fine. And black can also take with the a pawn because in this case black doesn't have isolated double pawns anymore, just double pawns, and they can protect each other fairly well. And in return for these double pawns, black also has the semi-open file, so now black has activated the rook on a8, and this is one advantage that double pawns give, that they provide more open lines for the pieces, so they can help activate the pieces more easily. That's why taking on b6 is not in line with the idea of doubling pawns, and white played the move bishop to a3, which is a very strong move. First of all, it develops the bishop, but it is also eyeing the square, c5. Now white has two pieces controlling that square, and here we see a problem that we saw when we analyzed isolated pawns, that the square in front of the pawn can sometimes become weak. And here white now has control of c5, and now white will continue with queen to d2, and then will be able to castle long. White has many pieces on the queen side, has good control of the queen side, that's why the king is going to be safe on the queen side. And in this position, white has a better position based on the pawn structure. Another problem that black might have with these isolated double pawns is that castling queenside for black here might be risky. Remember that the pawn structure in front of the king is important and this pawn structure is damaged in this case, so double pawns might also expose the king. Let's now analyze another position. Here black has double pawns on the c file, but these pawns are not isolated, so all these pawns are connected on the queen side. In return for that, black also has the bishop pair here. Black has the bishop on d7 and the bishop on f8. We can also see that the d file is an open file, but since black has double pawns, black has a semi-open file on the e file. So one idea might be to bring the rook on h8 to e8 after developing the knight and the bishop. So for example, black might sooner or later try developing the bishop, let's say to d6, then knight to e7, and then bring the rook to e8. And here black is having fairly active pieces, so black will try to compensate the double pawns with active piece play. So all in all, the position is fairly balanced here. In the game, black first played the move bishop to e6, which is an interesting move because it controls the c4 square, which is fairly weak for black, and it might prevent knight to c4 ideas by white. But on the other hand, what black shouldn't be looking for is to trade all pieces. This would definitely benefit white. For example, let's imagine that we trade all pieces and we only keep the pawns and the kings on the board. We will get this position, and here we see another problem of double pawns, which I briefly mentioned at the beginning, is that double pawns have less mobility. And in this position, here we get an ending, and it is very critical to promote pawns or to try to promote them, and a very common idea is to create a pass pawn. And in this case, black has 4 pawns on the queen side against 3 pawns. So here black has a pawn majority on the queen side, and white has 4 pawns on the king side against 3. So white has a king side pawn majority. But the problem with black's pawns is that they are doubled and they cannot easily create a pass pawn. For example, let's imagine that here black plays king to d7, trying to activate the king. Then white might try playing c4, and let's say that black plays the move c6. White can play b3, and now white has fixed the pawn structure on the queen side. And let's say that after b5, then we can simply just bring the king, and there's no way for black to create a pass pawn. So there's no way to try to promote a pawn. For example, if black takes, this would just be bad because after taking, now black gets isolated double pawns. And now white, sooner or later, we try to maybe first bring the king and then try to get a pass pawn on the e-file by playing moves like f4 and e5. And this is definitely not what black should be looking for when having double pawns. So instead, black should try to look for activity and attacking possibilities, but generally not go for exchanges. So double pawns can be a weakness, particularly when they are isolated double pawns. They have less mobility, they can create weaknesses, they can be attacked more easily. But on the other hand, they can sometimes be useful, particularly if they control important squares or if they help activate our pieces.